Oh, that's nice to hear. And
Thank you, Paul.
thank you, Paul. And while your young leaders were focused so much on land claims, they were focused on communications, the introduction of television into the Arctic, and all the consequences of that. They were active on so many fronts. But along came the big stage in Canadian politics that were not just limited to people in the North, et cetera, et cetera. Let me pull up the PowerPoint and I'll do a screen share and we'll walk through that. We'll use that as a guide. Dan, give me an update, please, on the questions, the focus questions. What's the status of that? Have people seen them and had a chance to look at them?
Yeah, no, we've just been chatting, but I have them available now. They're not in the notebooks yet, but why don't I share my screen? I could show them the questions at some point.
Yes.
And if that's
And
okay with you.
yeah, please take note of them, folks, and Dan will circulate them after you've read them. But it's just a kind of red flags for what to be listening for and what information to grab on the way by.
So
Because it's not stuff you need to know fully in every detail, but the story itself is important story. So just invite you to take it in as a story and listen to the significance of it, as well as who was involved, et cetera, and what the lasting effects of what they did has been. So that's the main intent of covering this. So
here are the questions, Murray, and I'll be happy to pop them into the student notebooks as you're talking. So
take a careful read through these questions, just let them sink in and in your mind, so you know what information is important to come away with, and make your notes as fast as you can. I mean, if I were you, I'd be sitting with a pad of paper and a pen just to scratch things down on the fly, just by number the questions, and so you know what your information refers to when you look at it later.
Murray, so I'm just going to be putting them in student notebooks, but in the meantime, how about I just put the link in the Zoom chat? So if anyone wants to, have access to them right away, it will take me about 5 or 10 minutes to pop them into notebooks.
I'd like to let people just look at them on the screen here. Well, if
Perfect,
just
you got it.
So just read through them, folks, and if you pause and have a question, say, what the hell does that mean? What are you asking? Just ask me. Just ask on the way by. So you have a clear sense of what you should be sort of listening for, training your ear on this one. Can you scroll down?
Hey, I have something to add on with
Sure.
the question number 6. I don't know if it was you or somebody, but how why was it hard to come to an agreement in creating this new constitution?
Yeah.
Hence what groups had to come together. You talked about how when there was a train full of people fighting for it. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah, that's part of that happened during this time, during this story. There was a called the Constitution Express. Whole trainload of First Nations from Vancouver picking up people all the way across the country. So I'll tell you about when that fit into the story as I go through it today.
All right.
It's good of you to remember that.
Am I going too fast?
After we look at this, can we go to the top again after?
Yeah. But I'll be putting up the PowerPoint on the screen, so they won't be visible as I'm talking. Or as Dan says, Dan Senny putting them into your notebooks. Is that what it is, Dan?
Dan, are you able to fix the numbering when you hand them in? There's no question 8.
Oh my goodness.
I'm just typing them out right now. I'm asking.
Thank you.
That's a bonus question.
There you go.
If you offer an answer and there's no question, you get extra points. All right, let's keep going. No. You make that a bit bigger? For us old folks? Thanks. Right on, right on, right on. That's good, that's good. So, did you get through to the bottom already? I can't hear you, Dan.
Apologies. I keep going on mute because my kids are loud. Ro had asked me to go back to the top. I'm
Oh, yeah.
I'm happy to scroll through as fast as you like.
Can people signal if they're ready to move on? I'm going to share the screen with my PowerPoint. And when people are ready,
So Murray, what I'll do is I will just share the link to those questions in the chat.
Okay.
So I will be putting all those questions, copying them into your notebooks. But if you want to do it faster, like right away, you're welcome to do that yourself.
okay, and I'll leave it to you to manage the chat then, Dan, if you're using that vehicle. Does that work? Okay, right on. All right. Anybody not ready? You want me to take any longer? Otherwise, I'll just go ahead. All right. Can't hear anybody. Here we go. So this is obviously the course we're in, and let me get myself out of the way here. You know, and the whole image we've used right from the outset is you folks being confronted with Southern society coming up to the Arctic in ways that it never had come up before, and that because of the discovery of oil and gas in Alaska and all that stuff, and just an explosion of exploration activities, basically industrial society from the South coming up, not just government bureaucrats and administrative managing people, but this was an assault on the land and the waters, the ocean itself, and a combination of things. One, everybody felt in the North felt this is they've got to do something to stand in the way of this whole invasion and get it to slow down, get it to change direction, just like a big super tanker, and make and regain control of what was going on in their own world, whether it was in the Nunavut or Nunavut or Nunavik, etc. So that's, and we've said from the beginning, it was a very small number of people that put themselves out in front of it, came down to Ottawa, formed the organization ITC, and stood in the path of all this stuff, or tried to, before they even knew how to do it and what it was going to take, but they just did it. And people in their early 20s to mid 20s, not that old to be taking on such a challenge. Now, this was in the context of land claims. It was you guys against one government, the government in Ottawa. On the issue of the Constitution, it was you folks against the federal government and 10 provinces. So in terms of Canada's politics, you were getting onto the big stage of the biggest stage of Canadian politics. Your leaders were wanting to become players on that big stage as well, not just dealing with one government, because the Constitution, as I'll describe it, involves the federal government and all 10 provinces. And to get included in any constitution requires an agreement by all of those parties. So if you thought they had their work cut out for them, dealing with land claims and dealing only with the federal government, it just the challenge multiplied, as this graphic suggests. The challenge they had to face and figure out how to do things. So that's the backdrop, sort of image to go with this whole story of Inuit rights in the Constitution. And so let me give you a little bit of theoretical understanding of constitutions and what's the big deal? What is a constitution? What is the big deal about it? It does basic things. A constitution, when it's written down, explains a number of things. First of all, it outlines what kind of government it's going to be. Is it going to be by election? And if so, what are the rules for those elections? And how often do they have to happen, et cetera, et cetera. So the country will be governed by people who are chosen by the people themselves, a democratic country. And not all countries function that way. So that's a cornerstone of what our Constitution does. And our governments are elected by the people in a regular way, typically once every 4 years at the most. And that's one of the cornerstone things that a constitution does. It also identifies what authority the governments have, and what powers do they have to make us do things or prevent us from doing things. I mean, all the laws are created by governments, right? And that's their authority. And a constitution also outlines how government is going to be funded, how much governments can tax, what they can tax, and what kind of taxes can they raise to pay for themselves as a government. They have the power to demand we hand money over to them. So that's what.
Did you see we can't have sleepover?
Sorry, I couldn't understand what you just said. Please repeat.
Oh, go off mute, please, unless you're talking to Murray about the course. Thank you.
Oh, I see. Yeah, and anybody who wants to just go off mute and signal to me to stop on a particular point while you ask more about it. And these are just sort of the outline pieces, but there's information that goes with all of these if you're curious. And so the Constitution outlines what kind of taxes governments can raise. And so those are only three, those are three cornerstone things that governments, the constitutions outline. In terms of division of powers, there's, I don't know if you knew this, but the Queen, or now the King Charles, owns all of Canada, according to the theory. But that theory was rooted in real life terms back in the 1400s, 1500s, where the crown, whoever wore it, was technically the legal owner of it, the whole bloody country. That's just a fiction now, of course, but it's still kept as a ceremonial thing. But Canada's first constitution was written in 1867 not by Canadians, but by the British. And they enacted an act in the British Parliament, House of Commons, to create Canada. And so it was a piece of British legislation, 1867. And it brought together 4 provinces initially: Upper Canada, Lower Canada, or Ontario and Quebec, in other words, and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. There were four provinces at the start, 1867. But what the British North America Act did was say there are going to be 2 levels of government in this country called Canada. There's going to be a federal government and provincial governments. So 2 levels of governments have their own authority derived from the crown. And so they're separate entities. And then the Constitution, the British North American Act, it's known as the BNA Act, it outlined Section 91 and Section 92. Each contained a list of what one government could do or the other one could do. And this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but as an example of what the federal government was given responsibility for. Generally, it's the one that collects taxes from people across the country, as we all know. I mean, Nunavut doesn't, you don't have to file taxes to Nunavut. We don't have to file taxes to Ontario down here. All the taxes go to the federal government. And the federal government looks after national things like the military. There's one military in Canada. There's not 10 different militaries. It looks after borders, protecting our borders, and managing who comes in and what goes out. Manages postal service, fisheries, immigration, and things like that involve the entire country. Provinces were given the power, and this is very important in terms of the law and politics. Provinces own the land within their borders. Ontario owns all the crown land. All the crown land in Ontario belongs to the province, not to the federal government. And that means they also own the resources on that land and under it. So provinces get their revenue from the development of land and exploitation of resources. Provincial governments also have the power to give some of their own powers down to a lower level of government, like municipalities and cities, who look after, streets and education and things like that. Provinces run the healthcare services and other social services that serve people. They're more frontline services for people. And so they tried to, in the BNA Act, they tried to really make the lines clear between what the 2 levels of government did, so they wouldn't bump into each other, they wouldn't overlap, they wouldn't run into conflict. And one of the notable things that happened when they wrote the BNA Act, the question came up, which of these governments is going to be responsible for relations with Indigenous people that are already there in the country? And that was handed to the federal government. In that day, Inuit actually were not even part of the lands involved in Canada, so they were outside of Canada. Canada hadn't expanded to the Arctic yet. But in those days, that meant the federal government was responsible for relations with Indians and lands reserved for Indians, period. Section 9124. And so 2 levels of government, each with different responsibilities. And that's the structure of the original Canadian Constitution from 1867. Now, I'll just give you a little glimpse of some of the history, but you don't need to remember it, so don't worry about it, but just take it in. It helps to explain why things happened when they did a bit later on. And in the 20th century, 80 years later, after the BNA Act was passed in Britain, the balance of responsibility between the federal government and provinces changed. Provinces were having to provide a lot more in the way of social programs and stuff like that, and they didn't have the tax base to support them, so they always needed money from Ottawa, and that meant decades of fights between Ottawa and the provinces about who's going to pay for different things. And in the 1960s, something grew in Quebec that posed a threat to the entire country, because there was a separatist movement in Quebec. A generation of people who felt very strongly that Quebecers are Francophone and the rest of Canada is English, and there shouldn't be any real relationship between us. We shouldn't be confined to the same country. Quebec should move towards separating from Canada. A very profound threat to the existence of our country, and as we've always known it. And there were throughout the decade of the 70s, there were a number of conferences involving the federal government and the provinces, trying to see how they could change the Constitution to accommodate Quebec, so they could feel that they had some more power, but they were still in Canada. Anyway, the long and the short of it was they could never find agreement, the provinces or the feds. And Quebecers were getting more and more frustrated. In 1976, there was a new political party in Quebec that its platform said, we think Quebec should be a separate country. And they got elected. And they got a majority in the Quebec legislature, a party that wanted to separate from Canada. That sent shockwaves through the rest of the country. And it was a real constitutional challenge. 4 years later, Pierre Trudeau, Justin's father, he was reelected in 1980, and I should mention there had been a referendum, which is kind of a vote in Quebec, just not in the government of Quebec, but in the whole population of Quebec, asking people the whole public of Quebec, if they wanted to move in the direction of separating from Canada. And it was the majority said no, they didn't, but it was a very close vote. So there was about 40%, just over 40% of Quebecers wanted to separate from Canada. And so Trudeau, when he was reelected in 1980, he announced they couldn't get an agreement with the provinces to move ahead with a new constitution that would hopefully create room in Canada for Quebec to be more of itself. So he announced that the Canadian government was going to draft a new version of a constitution by itself, without trying to get agreement from the provinces. And so they drafted it, and it included something called a Charter of Rights. I'll speak a bit more about that. That was a radical new thing to include in a constitution. And at that time, this was the late 1970s, just before Trudeau made that, the Inuit Committee on National Issues was a committee of the leadership of ITC. And these are people by that time, in their early 30s at the most, so they're all still young, and but with more and more experience under their belt dealing with governments on land claims issues and other things. So, but they saw that any chance that Canada was going to write a new constitution, it was going to affect Indigenous people and it was going to affect Inuit, either because they're left out of it and forgotten, or they wanted to have some influence on what any new constitution was going to say, especially about Aboriginal rights. So they formed their committee of leaders. Also, here's some explanation of who the people were involved in the main. There's Pierre Trudeau, Prime Minister in those days. René Lévesque in Quebec, he was the leader of the party that wanted to separate from Canada. So they had a long-term sort of battle between the two of those politically. But here's the Inuit Committee on National Issues. At least 4 of the people involved, the main people. There was Mark R. Gordon from Nunavik, Eric Taguna, Peter Atenuat, who was MP, the first Inuk member of Parliament. You'll be seeing him, what day is it? Next week, you'll be seeing him next week. And Charlie Watt, of course, from Nunavik. And John A. was a co-chair with Charlie Watt of that committee. So they were kind of the action team to start lobbying the government to think about including some recognition of Aboriginal rights in any new constitution. So they suddenly had that on their plate as well. Let me mention something called the Charter of Rights, because this was a very controversial part of what the Trudeau government tabled in 1980, beginning of it was end of 1980. When they said we're gonna propose that we write the Constitution by ourselves. Heck with the provinces; they can never agree on things, so we're gonna do it. And they included a Charter of Rights. And what does that do? It outlines a whole variety of ways that in which governments all governments in Canada will have to treat people so that they're treated equally. And that sounds reasonable and fair, doesn't it? But and they listed these, based on people have to be treated equally no matter what their race, their national or ethnic origin, their color, their religion, their sex, their age, or mental or physical disability. That's in the Charter of Rights. And what made that significant was the old Constitution only outlined the rights of governments, the rights of the provincial governments and the rights of the federal government. That's what a constitution was intended to do in the old days. But a Charter of Rights added another piece, and it was, what are the rights of individuals in society, not just governments. And now this proposal for a Charter of Rights to protect people's rights, there were a good number of provinces that went ballistic over this. And in fact, because they didn't want any rules limiting what they could do or not do. But whereas this Charter of Rights put limits on what governments were allowed to do. They weren't allowed to discriminate against people on any basis. And so here's a chronology. And this is the most important year. It was 1981. And because they were Trudeau's government put this draft out for public discussion. This is their vision of what a new constitution would be, even if they did it by themselves. And they formed a special committee, a one-time only committee of people from the House of Commons and senators, from the Senate, to hold public hearings to see what the public thought about their draft of a new constitution. This would be a constitution written by Canadians in Canada, rather than a constitution written by British politicians in London, England, as had been the case with the BNA Act. And so they created this committee, and there was one Indigenous member of Parliament at that time, Peter Atenuat, your MP. And he was on that committee. He got a seat on that committee. And after a great deal of lobbying by ICNI and other indigenous groups. The first Assembly of First Nations was active, and so were the Métis. To get some recognition of Aboriginal rights included, they were successful up to a point, but it was an historic point. And in the end, on that committee, after they'd listened to all the public inputs and stuff, Peter Atenuar moved the motion. Your member of parliament was the one that moved that motion. That said the following: in the draft of the Constitution, the Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. And the second clause in that was, Aboriginal peoples include Indians, Inuit, and Métis. That became what's known as Section 35 in the Constitution today. So they did a tremendous amount of lobbying. Peter and the Inuit were in a good position because Peter, even though he was in the New Democratic Party, he was very close to the Liberal politicians. They were actually trying to entice him to cross the floor from the point where he even landed on Parliament Hill and joined the Liberal Party. So he was very, he had ready access to the government politicians. So did ICNI. The First Nations groups, the Indian groups, they had a different kind of relationship with the federal government, and it's based on a couple of 100 years of history of mistrust. And so they tended to stomp around and demand things, whereas your leaders could get into the room and have conversations with the people they wanted to influence.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
What's a motion?
Oh, a motion? It's just a resolution, a proposed resolution to include in a document or something like, or to pass something, you know. And I move that we include the following clause in the new Constitution, something like that. It's just that's a motion, and it's a procedural thing. Is that clear enough?
So it's like a proposal to put
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
writing in the Constitution?
Yeah, it's a proposal.
Okay.
And, but it's a formal procedure, and because it goes into the minutes as somebody moved this be done, and somebody moved that be done, and stuff like that. So that's the language it is, but it's just a proposal and a recommendation, you know. And it's something that then people vote on.
Okay.
I'd like people to consider this idea. Could we have a vote on this? And get in or out or not, you know? And so that's what it is. Anyway, so that was the motion was approved by that special committee to include in the draft of the Constitution in the winter of '81. And for the next few months, several provinces took the federal government to court to try and stop it from writing a new Constitution by itself. Why? Two reasons. One, they didn't think it was right that one level of government could write the rules for what kind of power the other level of government was going to have. If there were two levels of government in Canada, it wasn't fair for one of them to, by itself, define what powers the other one was going to have, the provinces. But they also disagreed with this draft because of the Charter of Rights. They didn't want governments to didn't want the Constitution to put a limit on what they had authority to do. And they thought that authority should ultimately reside in elected people, not something written down on a piece of paper. And so there were two reasons they went to court, and they had mixed success. They didn't win and they didn't lose. They did both. So in the end, by later in the spring, Trudeau and the federal government threw up their hands and said, okay, there's people are having a lot of problems with whether we can move forward on our own with this Constitution. And they said, let's stop all the other court proceedings. We'll go to the Supreme Court ourselves and ask the Supreme Court to decide if we can write the Constitution alone or if we have to have the agreement of the provinces? It's a simple question, but it about who did the federal government have the authority to do it if it wanted? So the courts thought about that over the summer. And in September of 1981, or during that time, I should mention, here's where the Inuit and the First Nations split in their strategies. Because that clause, as it was written, that Peter had moved, the motion that he moved, the Aboriginal rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed, again, didn't say what those rights actually were. It did not define them. It just said they exist and they are affirmed. That no government could question whether such rights exist anymore. Now, here's where they split with the First Nation. And I was there at those days. This was when I started working with Peter, right in the midst of this story here. And it was absolutely fascinating to watch the dynamics between the First Nations and the Inuit in terms of their strategies. Because I remember being sitting in the back of a room with a big meeting between the two groups, and the Métis were in there too. And they were trying to figure out strategy. How do we react? And because the question was, well, the First Nations, I always remember this guy, this big First Nations guy from BC. The question was, the government's position was, we'll define those rights later. We'll define them later. We'll just put this clause in, says there are rights, but we don't know what they are yet. We'll define them later. Here's where the Inuit and First Nations went in different directions. First Nations folks, they wouldn't accept that clause because it didn't define the rights at the same time. And I remember this big fellow from BC, First Nations guy, and he was at this meeting and he pounded on the table. He said, we can't, on the question of should we trust the government to follow through later? And speaking out of a very long history of dealings with the federal government, he said, we can't trust the government to do it later. It's never worked for us. And that, again, speaking out of a long history. And so they opposed that clause. And they went to London, England, because whatever was decided here in Canada, again, had to be accepted over in Britain in order to eliminate the British North America Act over there and its authority. Anyway, so they went over to London, put up their headdresses on, and got lots of attention. But the Inuit leadership, because they were small in number, with the First Nations, there's 630 chiefs. And there's a lot of internal discord in that big crowd. But the Inuit leadership was small, tight, had a single vision, and they also had access to the Liberal government people. The Minister of Justice, Jean Chrétien, they had access to Trudeau, and so they could get into the rooms with the government and make their case. And their position was, yes, the clause that they've approved so far does not define our rights, but it's a foot in the door. And once we're in the door, we will work to expand what those rights mean. So they were willing to trust the government to follow through in the years afterwards. So they were supporting the government's position. And this was over the summer. And then here's what led to the final outcome. In September, the Supreme Court judges had taken their summer to consider the question of, does the federal government have the authority, the legal authority to go ahead on its own and write a constitution for the country? Or does it need, should it involve the provinces too? And the Supreme Court came down. It was the first time that there was such public interest. It was the first time cameras were in the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, the sound didn't work. And but the court said two things. One, it said, well, technically, the federal government could go ahead on its own. Legally and technically, according to the letter of the law, it could do that. But the judges also said, but in Canada, it's always been a tradition for governments to work together. So in order to have legitimacy, the federal government should do its best to secure, quote unquote, substantial support from the provinces. Didn't say all provinces had to agree. It just basically threw it back to the politicians to sort it out. But it was a message to the Trudeau government. You should get some buy-in from the provinces here, and just for the optics almost, and so people will believe in what's going to come out the other end. So that was in September. So up to that point, there was a draft of a new constitution. It had a charter of rights, and it also had recognition of equality rights and in the charter, and also recognition of Aboriginal rights, even if they weren't defined. So, and here's some of the people involved. That's Jean Chrétien. He was Minister of Justice. He carried the torch for the federal government in a lot of the negotiations. This guy, Harry Daniels, very famous Métis leader and good friend of Peter. And there's Peter here, Peter at Pinoir. And Peter was in the thick of these negotiations because he was a member of Parliament. And so the Métis, Peter had a lot of influence on getting the Métis recognized in the whole thing. And at one point he had told Chrétien, when they were considering the motion that Peter moved, that if the government didn't include the Métis, the Inuit wouldn't back what the government was doing. So he played an extremely helpful role for the Métis, but only largely because he was in a unique position as a member of Parliament. So he was on the inside of what was happening in the government. Here's what happened. This is the culmination of it. November, for 2 days, November 4th, well, 3 days actually, 3rd to the 5th of 1981 in the fall. Because the court had said the federal government should try and get some kind of buy-in from the provinces, he called a meeting of the premiers, 10 premiers. And they came to Ottawa, and it was on live television. This was the big league. I was thinking earlier today, for you folks, negotiating with the government on land claims, trying to get the government to do what you wanted on land claims, was like junior hockey league. The Constitution stuff was like the NHL. This was the big league stuff, because it was the highest level of politics in Canada. Prime Minister and premiers. And you guys were knocking on that door this time around. So Trudeau convened a meeting with the premiers, and there were two main issues that they had to wrestle with. Should there be a Charter of Rights and Freedoms in there? Remember, there are a good number of provinces that hated it because it limited their ability to make their own laws. It sort of specified what they couldn't do. And then there was an issue of what's called an amending formula. How many provinces would it, in addition to the federal government, would it take to change the new constitution as it develops? And that was a big issue. It didn't want to be just the federal government. So if it didn't meet, if it had to be more than the federal government, how many provinces were needed to agree to make a change? So those are two very strong political issues. And here's what they did. On the second night, the night of the 4th, Trudeau and the premiers, behind closed doors overnight, they cut a deal. They cut a deal. And the next morning, Trudeau convened them into the meeting. Again, this is all on live TV in Canada. And he announced that they had a deal. It had been reached overnight. And enough provinces had agreed to include a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was Trudeau's dream. But they built in a mechanism where a provincial legislature like Quebec or Ontario could pass a law saying that in this case, we're going to opt out of the Charter of Rights, the requirements of that, but it's only for a limited time. And so they gave them a little bit of wiggle room on specific matters. And then the second issue that they agreed on was an amending formula. And they decided that it would, to change the Constitution, to add to it or whatever, they'd need the approval of the federal government and 7 provinces who had 50% of Canada's population. That meant Ontario and Quebec were in for sure, had to be in there because they had the most people, and some combination of other provinces. Had to be 7 provinces. And so far so good. So far so good. But when it was quite a dramatic scene because Trudeau convened the meeting, again on live television, announced that there's a deal had been reached. He highlighted these 2 things, and then he banged the gavel and said, thanks to everybody, and the conference is over. And everybody ran for cover. And I'm particularly provincial premiers. Why? Because there were 2 things taken out of that deal overnight. In order to get enough buy-in from enough provinces, there are certain provinces that says we're not going to sign any new constitution unless with these couple of things in it. What were they? This is what was left out of their deal, of their final deal. Women's equality rights. Remember I said in the Charter of Rights, it included the right for everybody to be treated equally on any basis, including their gender. And there were enough, all the premiers were men, and there were just enough premiers who weren't willing to support equal rights for women. And so they yanked it. And as part of the deal. So women could be treated unequally if governments wanted to do that. Whereas all the other categories were still to be treated equally. Second thing they pulled out, the Aboriginal rights, the recognition of Aboriginal rights. I was there that morning and we were standing outside. It was in the old train station, just across from the Chateau Laurier. That's where the conference was being held. And I was with Peter because I worked with Peter in his office. And I was his executive assistant. And Peter and John A. and Charlie Watt were waiting outside the building because the Aboriginal leaders weren't a part of the conference. And the Minister of Indian Affairs, John Munro, who was very close to Peter, had a very close working relationship with Peter, even though Peter was from the NDP and Munro was Liberal. Anyway, he came out with his tail between his legs to break the news that the rights that Inuit had successfully argued for, and they had supported the Trudeau government based on an assumption, on a confidence that Trudeau wouldn't sell them out. Well, he did. He sold their rights away in order to get a deal on other things. And I remember we walked across over to Parliament Hill to Peter's office that morning, and boy, were people boiling. They were just boiling. And Munro tagged along, but he was looking very embarrassed by what had happened, and because he didn't have any say over it at all. And I always remember Peter and John A. and Charlie got on the phone, on the speakerphone on Peter's desk, and they couldn't sit down. They were so agitated. They were so upset. They'd been sold out. They supported the government, and the government abandoned them as a price for getting their constitutional deal. They left them hanging right out there. And people, and the 3 of them were pacing around Peter's desk that morning on the phone to somebody, all in Inuktitut, all very agitated, and all the only words I could hear them in English were screwed, fucked, and words like that. And they had really been hung out to dry. And it was that night, the spirits were very dark, and they put their money on Trudeau supporting them, and he walked out on them when the going got tough. So that was November 5th, 1981. That was the low point in the process, but it wasn't the end of the process, because the Inuit leadership, Peter in particular, had good relations with the Liberal government, with Monroe, and even with Trudeau. Unlike the First Nations, who organized big demonstrations on the hill, that's where that constitutional train came to town. And I should say, the removal of the women's equality rights just provoked this huge outrage across Canada amongst women and men, that a bunch of 10 or 11 men behind closed doors felt free to withdraw equality rights for women. It was a huge surge in the women's rights movement in Canada and the organization of it. But also, there was a huge response in Canada against the removal of Aboriginal rights from the draft constitution. And again, the Constitutional Express, this train that was organized, a whole train that was organized in BC, picking up First Nations folks all the way across the country, and they rolled into town, and there was a huge demonstration on Parliament Hill, and people were just really angry, really angry across the country. And one of the interesting things we witnessed was that really caught the government's attention. To be frank, the governments were long used to Indians protesting and being mad at them, and that's the history of our country, and no fault to the First Nations. But they had never encountered protests by Inuit, and it hit them on a nerve that no other group could ever equal. Because what happened was, and I can't remember if the word got out to do it or if people did it spontaneously, but television picked it up, because television was now into the north. In a variety of Inuit communities in Northwest Territories, people were so upset as well that they went out and lowered the Canadian flag on public buildings, on government buildings in their communities. And boy, let me tell you, I was close enough to the scene on Parliament Hill to know that caught the government's attention more than a demonstration of Indians on the lawn of Parliament Hill, because that touched on the whole issue of sovereignty, Canadian sovereignty to the Arctic. And here were the people living in the Arctic who were lowering the flag and marching in their own hamlets to do it. And this was a shock to people down in government people in Ottawa, because the Inuit leadership was very constructive in their attempts to build relationships and stuff. But the message was, if the government's going to walk out on us, we'll walk out on Canada. And so that caught the government's attention. And within a couple of days of November 5th, the Inuit leadership strategized and began to react. And what did they do? They were able to set up a meeting with Trudeau at his house, 24 Sussex, because they had relations with the government people. And Charlie and John A. and Peter went and met with him, and they asked what they did. They said, "This is not right, what's happened. We need, there had to be 7 provinces who would agree for Aboriginal rights, the Aboriginal Rights Clause to get in. And there were only 6 that had on that overnight meeting. So they needed 1 more province to get back on board in order to get that clause put back in. So they said to Trudeau, give us 2 weeks. Give us 2 weeks so we can go across the country and find a premier, 1 more premier to say yes to having our rights recognized in the Constitution. And Trudeau said, because they had relationships, and Trudeau said, okay, I'll give you 2 weeks or whatever it was. So they hit the road pretty darn fast and visiting provincial capitals. And by the end of of those 2 weeks, they had got one province, one additional province, Alberta, to sign back on and support the inclusion of your rights in our Constitution. And with only the slightest change in the wording. There's what I said, both huge public protest to the whole thing. Alberta was persuaded to accept Aboriginal rights as long as it was only existing rights. In other words, nobody knew what that meant. It was just a way to look like they had negotiated something, but basically there was so much public opposition to what the premiers had done. They were looking for a way to salvage their reputations by putting things back in, including the rights for women. And so the Section 35 now reads: the Aboriginal rights of the Aboriginal peoples, the existing Aboriginal rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. What the hell is this about? And so they got it back in. You know, the First Nations leadership, as I say, were on Parliament Hill protesting, but your leaders played their card. They had cards in their hands that the others didn't, and that was access to the politicians that were making the decision. And they came up with a constructive strategy, and they pulled it off. They pulled it out of the hat. And so, in December 10th, 1981, Parliament passed the resolution, the Patriation Resolution, saying this is what we want our new Constitution to say. It included the Charter of Rights. It included Aboriginal protection of Aboriginal rights and recognition of them, et cetera, et cetera. And I was up in the House of Commons gallery. It was just packed for the passage of that resolution. And then once the vote was in, and everybody in the place stood up and sang "O Canada" together. April 17th, 1982, the Queen came to town and signed the new Constitution on Parliament Hill. And what they did, what the new Constitution said, and this is a follow-up to the government's earlier promise that we'll define your rights later. We'll define your rights later. Just trust us. We'll get at it. We'll get on it. So that draft of the Constitution promised a conference within 1 year of after the Queen signs the thing, to have a conference with the premiers and the Indigenous leaders from the different organizations to begin the process of defining what those Aboriginal rights mean. And here's what it looked like on the day of the signing. Apparently the Queen's pen didn't work at first. And I was in the crowd there with my 3-year-old daughter, amongst all the other thousands of people. It was a cold and windy day. So what happened was, a year later, this was the Queen signed it in April '82. A year later, just like had been promised, they had a conference on Aboriginal rights in Ottawa. The only thing it accomplished was, which was very little, they made clear that the language, the Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, they added a clause making it clear that treaty rights also included land claims rights, because that's what was being negotiated in the 70s and 80s. And they thought way ahead, and they thought 100 years from now, we don't want some government to say, well, you've got a land claim. That's not a treaty. Treaties are protected in the Constitution and land claims aren't, so you're out of luck. So they just wanted to tuck that into the text to make sure there's no wiggle room somewhere else down the line. And in some respects, that was important, because one of the main thing that the Constitution did by having the clause in there was anybody that had a land claims or was going to sign a land claims, it would be protected by the Constitution. Something governments could not interfere with after the fact, could not change that. It's interesting, it's amazing to note that before this constitution protected Aboriginal rights and treaty rights and land claims rights, the governments had the authority to pass their own law saying, from here on, all the Aboriginal rights of people in this territory are canceled, are eliminated. They don't exist anymore because we've passed a law saying that. This was the case even with Makivik. They signed theirs in 1975. It wasn't constitutionally protected. If it wanted in those days, government of Quebec, if it had reasons to want to, could have passed its own law saying the Northern James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement is hereby deleted. They had that power. Once those rights were recognized in the Constitution, they were out of reach of the governments, of any governments. Those things could only be changed with agreement by both parties. So that was one of the motivating factors that Makivik had, Charlie Watt had, just to get that protection for their land claims agreement.
And that the
yeah.
provincial governments who were able to take away their rights by making new laws.
They could have been before this constitution recognized Aboriginal rights. Yep, they could have passed a simple law saying they're toast. Their people have no rights. And just a side note on that, the whole Nisga'a thing. There's no treaties in BC. In that Supreme Court decision on the Nisga'a, on the question of, the Constitution at the time says the provinces own the land. The Nisga'a are saying they own the land too. You can't have two owners of the same land. What's up? And the court split on that because technically the Quebec's position was, BC's position was, once we join Canada, we automatically own the land. And but the Supreme Court, in its decision, because it split 3-3, three of the judges said, yeah, that's true. It automatically extinguished all the Nisga'a rights just because it became a province, and the Constitution said it owned the land. So therefore, there can't be any Nisga'a rights. But the other three judges said they had rights, and they have to still have them, because if you're going to take them away, you have to say you're doing it. They could have done it. The BC government for 100 years could have passed its own law saying you don't have any rights, but they didn't. They never got around to it because they didn't think they needed to. Anyway, it's a bit of a technical thing, but it's yeah. So anyway, these conferences. Yeah. Go ahead. Okay. These conferences that were happening, the first one in '83, this was prime time television, and they had the leaders of the 4 national Aboriginal organizations, because the Métis split into 2 different groups, and but they also had the territorial governments, 2 Northwest Territories and Yukon. So there were 17 players around the table in the conference center, and these were live on television for 2 or 3 days, and it was. And what they didn't make much progress, so they agreed to have 3 more of these conferences, 84, 85, and 87, just to continue working on defining what Aboriginal rights meant. But they never really accomplished a heck of a lot in terms of the substance, because there were still provinces that were holding back their agreements on anything that would give Indigenous people more power, because provinces owned the land and they were afraid of losing control over the access, over the resources. So it's whether it was Alberta or BC, depending on or Manitoba or Newfoundland, depending on who was their premier at the time. They allowed little to be accomplished. But on the other hand, the overall lasting effect of these conferences, because they were televised live on CBC, so they're big, and because they involved the premier and the prime minister and stuff like that. It gave the Canadian public, for the very first time, a chance to listen to national leaders of different Indigenous groups at length, not just in news clippings, a quote here and a quote there, but got to hear people express what their dreams were, what their aspirations were. And it was a very impressive array of leaders. And So what that process did, it didn't change much in what was written in the Constitution, but it made Aboriginal people players on the big stage of Canadian politics, because they had earned the right to sit around the same table with premiers and prime ministers, and they had the attention of the general public, who knew little about people up to that point. So that was its lasting effect, and there all sorts of memorable moments. There was Zebedee Nungack, who you've heard of by now from Quebec. He was at the table representing with ICNI at one point, and he began one of his opening remarks by saying, "Mr. Prime Minister, premiers, we are here today to make constructive damage to the status quo." And that captured the tone of the Inuit leadership. They weren't trying to be destructive. They weren't just angry. They were very focused. They were very determined, very clear in what they wanted, and they wanted to make changes in a constructive way. And but not a lot emerged from all these meetings, except, as I say, the public profile of Indigenous people, of the Indigenous leaders, and for the general public. And there were 3 conferences, and that was that. So here's some pictures from those days. There's Peter. That's the Premier of Ontario, Bill Davis. That's Trudeau. So that's how much Peter was in the middle of the action. Here he is sitting with Trudeau at the table, sort of advising him. Again, conferring with Trudeau. There's the last one. There's Peter and I in his office. And that was 1981, I guess. And we're both the same age, actually. So you're going to get to see Peter next week, I believe, on Wednesday. So this will give you some backdrop on what he was. He played a very historic role. First Inuk to be elected to the House of Commons. First person to speak Inuktitut in the House of Commons. And later on, 1982, he made a strategic move to. He basically sacrificed his own political career to get the government to agree to start the ball rolling towards creating Nunavut. And so he's quite a historic person. I'm glad he's going to be able to come. And so, well, that's it for me. I don't think there's any more. It doesn't look like there is. And so I'll stop there, but now you can ask me questions all you want. If there's bits of information you want to understand better or anything like that.
So many of the provinces didn't want to agree to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms
That's right.
in the beginning.
That's right. And that's because of the Charter of Rights, because the Charter put limits on what they were allowed to do with their legislation, and they couldn't discriminate against people if they wanted to, and treat people differently. They couldn't treat men and women differently, and they didn't like the idea of. There was a principle behind it too. They believed that the ultimate word should come from elected officials, not from a written law. And elected officials should have all the room they want to do what they want, because they're accountable to the people. So have you got those questions already? Do you have access to those questions?
Yeah, they should be in the notebook, and I know some of them. I'm hoping a lot of them were answering them like I was while you were
Okay, cool.
while you were talking. So Dan put them in a little while ago. So
Okay. Just one thing to reiterate: there are a number of reasons why your leadership was able to be effective, and as I mentioned, the First Nations, there's 630 chiefs that their organization represented. And some come from areas that had treaties, some didn't, some came from areas that didn't have treaties. There's east, there's west, so they were a big crowd to line up in a unified way. Your numbers were smaller, obviously, and your leaders were tight. They represented all the regions, and they could act very efficiently. They could be in one room whenever they wanted and decide fast what to do. And that's why they were able to, one of the reasons they were able to respond to that the night of the long knives, as it's been called, when things were cut. And that was a pretty exciting time in Canada's history, because the Canadian public was so activated. People that didn't get involved in politics were on the streets and in anger at the gall of these men doing these things. It offended Canadians' sense of fairness, a basic sense of fairness. And so the Inuit leadership could act, but also, as I kept saying, they had built good rapport with the government people, Chrétien and Trudeau and John Munro and stuff like that. So, and Peter was on the Hill as well. So they had a lot going for them that the other groups didn't have.
Okay, so Murray, some of the students are asking when the questions are due. So our next class is not until next Wednesday, right? So, and then we have all the holidays. So, well, the next class, like Peter, they should know. It would be good to know some of the stuff for when Peter comes in, right?
Oh yeah. You can ask him about anything about that experience. It was very intense, big politics in politics in the biggest way. And there they were. They were grappling with other issues at the same time, but they were able to move quick and see the need to do something and organize themselves to ahead of the curve. And at the end of the 70s, to be ready to be involved in it. And so they were getting into pretty sophisticated politics and coming out the other end with what they wanted. So that's yeah.
Okay. So we'll make the questions due for Tuesday morning.
Yeah. Well, I'll just sit here if anybody has any questions you want to clarify or go over.
Okay. And I think Dan put them under, the questions, look for Constitution 12.1. So look in your notebook under Constitution. They should be in there. If Dan, I don't know if Dan's still on here because his internet was no good, but I believe they're in Constitution 12. Yes, and please ask Murray questions. If you miss one of the answers, the tape, it is recorded, but ask him, he's here.
Yeah, you don't want to listen to me all over again. That's a recipe for getting a good sleep.
So the question here, number 7,
Mhm.
First Nations and Inuit have different opinions about how Indigenous people would be included.
Yeah.
So I would assume the answer would be their approach with the relationship with the government, because you said throughout the whole lecture that the natives were against them and didn't want to work with them, but you're saying that Inuit have like that type of relationship. Is that the answer you're looking for?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, more or less. The First Nations had such a long history of getting abused by the government, and they weren't willing to believe the government, put it that way, that it was going to do something for them later and to like define those rights later. They wanted the new Constitution to have those rights spelled out in detail right from the get-go. And I was just an observer on this, but my own observation was that the Inuit leadership, this was the first generation of people who were working with and in relation to the government, trying to blow that super tanker down on various fronts. So they were coming to the table with their own integrity and their expectation that the government would have the same integrity in return. And so they were willing to meet the government halfway. We'll accept this clause, even though it doesn't define all the rights possible. But we're going to hope that you, the government, will have the integrity to follow through on your promise to work on it later. So they were bringing good faith, and they were assuming good faith on the part of the government, because they didn't have a history of getting burned. And at this level of politics, so their starting position was one of bringing their own integrity, but also trusting the other side. Well, that's why that getting the Aboriginal Rights Clause yanked on November 5th really burned them, because they showed up to the table with in an honest manner, and were willing to trust, and that's how the Trudeau government really sold them out on that particular situation. And so the mood was very dark that night, I'll tell you. Boy. Anyway.
You also talked about how because you were saying you were in the room when the Native people and Peter were kind of like in conversations on deciding which side of the table they want to be on. And you said that the Native people went to England to protest, I would assume, right? Against it.
Yeah.
And do you know if that actually like made an effect, or if it made a difference or anything?
No, it didn't. It made headlines and interesting news stories. Because the First Nations went over during the summer of '81 to Britain, trying to line up political support in the British Parliament for whenever any resolution came over there to get passed. And because essentially the British had to cancel their legislation, their BNA Act, and say we don't have power over Canada anymore, or of any kind, even on paper. So so they went over and lobbied, and there would always be British politicians who wanted to be seen to be on side of the natives, the old colonial friggin' attitude. And so First Nations would get a lot of attention with wearing their traditional outfits and headdresses and stuff like that. So they knew that. They played that for all it was worth. And but Trudeau was furious at them. He was furious at them, and for trying to challenge what was being done in Canada. But Peter and Eric Taguna went over to England as well as part of their effort, and they met politicians too, and to build support for whatever the resolution was, as long as it had Aboriginal rights in it.
Okay.
Those are interesting times, let me tell you. I personally was very lucky I started with Peter in September of that year, just at the peak of all that stuff. And it was fascinating to be up close to watch it. Wasn't pretty, but it was sure interesting.
Do you know, like, how can I say it? I would just, no, sorry, I have to gather my thoughts.
Okay.
The first constitution was the British North America Act in 1867. But when did we start talking about the new constitution or updating?
Oh, sorry. Say the last part again, Rowan, please.
When did they start talking about the new constitution?
In the late 70s, 1978, 79, Trudeau signaled that he was getting tired of trying to get the provinces to agree to anything. And so he wanted, especially after Quebec elected a separatist government, that really spurred him on to action. He said, we're gonna create a new constitution, come hell or high water. Oh, okay, come hell or high water, and we'll do it alone if we have to, but we're gonna do it. And enough of this talk that's gone on for decades. They really needed to feel they had to accommodate Quebec and make room for Quebec so they wouldn't want to vote themselves out of Canada. So the late 70s.
Okay.
I would assume it's more of a to gain more power approach when Trudeau was trying to rewrite it.
Mhm.
In my perspective. or my
Yeah.
understanding.
Well, the charter took power away from all governments. And Trudeau was happy with that because it would protect individual rights. And the provinces weren't happy with that one, a lot of the provinces. But yeah, so all governments lost a bit of power with this Charter of Rights. And so that was why it was so contentious.
Because if it was rewritten and you talked like the only thing that I'm sorry, I'm trying to catch up on what you said. So that the Charter of Rights,
Yeah.
this whole lecture is about that, right?
It's one piece of the story. It's not the heart of it. It's not the only thing. The heart of it for us is the Aboriginal Rights Clause and the history of that being put in and taken out and put back in.
Okay. Gotcha.
And again, at the end of the day, one of the lasting benefits of having that clause in the Constitution, even though it doesn't define elaborately what Aboriginal rights means, it does, as I was highlighting, it does protect your land claims agreement from government ever being able to unilaterally change it or eliminate it even, but that's not conceivable really, but just even to change it. So it's a shield against the government doing what it wants with your land claims agreement. So that's a lasting permanent protection. So your land claims agreements are now an attachment to the Constitution.
So that the Constitution is what helped us get the land claims agreement? Is that what you're saying?
No, it didn't.
Kinda, no?
It was but once you've got an agreement, it's protected under the Constitution because the Constitution, Section 35 says the Aboriginal and treaty rights are hereby recognized and affirmed. So you can't take something away if it's recognized in the Constitution. And so it's a protection. It's a shield from government ever mucking around in it.
Okay. And then you talked about, I kind of lost track when you talked about who brought to the Supreme Court about if it could write itself,
About which
or
rights?
who was gonna. So it says May 1981,
Yeah.
Ottawa agrees to ask the Supreme Court to decide
Yeah.
if it can write by itself.
Yeah. Because prior to that, there were a couple of provinces that tried to go to court in their own province to stop the whole process that the federal government was undertaking to write the Constitution by itself. And they got mixed reaction. One court said, yeah, maybe yes. And the other court said, well, no, they shouldn't, and blah, blah. So Trudeau, instead of wading through different levels of courts in different places, Trudeau just said, okay, stop that process. We'll ask the top court in Canada whether we can do this Constitution by ourselves without the province's hand on the pen, and just get clarity on that. Get clarity, and then we'll know if we can do it. If we can, we're going to do it, and if we can't, well, we'll have to deal with the provinces. And as I was saying, the court came down and said both. Said the federal government, technically speaking, does have the authority to go ahead and draft the whole Constitution by itself, but according to the way we do things in Canada, that's not the way it should be done. The government should make best efforts to secure substantial support from provinces. What does that mean?
Okay.
They were leaving it to they were throwing it back to the politicians. The court didn't say how many provinces needed. That's what they were throwing back to the governments. And so they came up with that with that formula. How many need to agree to anything in to make it a constitution or to change it? And they said 7 provinces have to agree out of 10, and they have to have 50% of the population.
Okay.
And that still stands today. That's the rule.
I would assume provinces weren't willing to want to rewrite it or be a part of it because of the backlash. Is that why no one wanted to step up? Is that why there was only?
What backlash do you mean when you say that one?
Because you were saying at one point throughout the lecture, you were saying that one of the Inuit leaders had to go ask Alberta to agree with them in order to get the Aboriginal rights
Yeah.
back on the charter.
Well, in terms of backlash, there's a big backlash in the Canadian public against the fact that those politicians withdrew the equal rights for women clause and withdrew the Aboriginal rights clause. So there was a backlash for that amongst the people of Canada about that, and it just offended everybody's sense of fairness. And but then the Inuit leadership got Trudeau's permission to pause the whole process and give them a couple of weeks to go and lobby provinces that had not signed on or that did not agree to Aboriginal rights, and get the one more that they needed to make it 7. And so once Alberta came on board, then there was enough to put that clause back in.
Why would you think Alberta didn't want to sign on in the beginning?
Just like BC at the time and Manitoba, they were afraid that any recognition of Aboriginal rights would challenge the provincial ownership of their land and their resources. And so anything that Indians in their provinces got was going to be a loss for everybody else in that province. You know, that was the fear, because the Aboriginal rights weren't defined. So they could still be defined in all sorts of ways, and they were scared of that.
Okay. It was a matter of just protecting the general population of each province, right? I would assume.
Protecting their control over their land and their resources. They didn't want to share. They didn't want somebody interfering with their complete control of everything.
Okay. Gotcha.
Thanks for your questions. Good questions.
When they had to go to Alberta to convince the person, what was that person's role called?
It was the premier. It was the premier.
Premier.
Yeah.
Got that word. Okay.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that happened in the 80s when they had those conferences in 83, then 84, 5, and 7, there was very little time in those conferences because they're generally 2 days, and with 17 players around the table, everybody would make opening statements, and that would take the first day, and then the second day, the afternoon of the second day, everybody would make closing statements, and that would take half a day. So there's very little time for negotiation. And the premiers that didn't want to expand the definition of Aboriginal rights, their technique was just say, we don't really understand fully what you mean. Could you say more about what you mean? And and just keep asking questions without committing themselves to making a decision themselves. And they just let the clock run itself out. Oh, time's up. We haven't sort of developed enough of an understanding to know what we would be agreeing to. So that's too bad. So it was very easy for them to play that card. And they didn't like, because they were on national television, they didn't like the sound like they were against things, but they just wanted more clarity all the time. They weren't satisfied that they understood it well enough what was being asked. And on and on and on and on it went. There's a great film called Dancing Around the Table, which documents those conferences. And it shows you how they handled themselves.
Hey, Murray.
Yep.
My friend Ojibwe, he just posted something. Did you see something in the news about the Sajin Nation claiming Sabo Beach, getting their right to own the beach after 1800, and they broke the treaty from 1875, so the government just ruled in their favor. So it's still happening like every day, pretty much, eh?
Yeah, I think there was a Saugeen Nation. I think if there's one in Manitoba and there's one in Ontario, so I don't know which one that is.
Yeah.
And, oh yeah, there's people are continue to claw back what they've lost.
Oh, yeah. And there's it's been ongoing because it's a tourist area, and it's a
Yeah.
lot of money coming into the local government. So yeah, so it's really interesting. I hope you guys pay attention because there's a lot of interesting stuff you're learning. And if you turn on the news, anything Murray's talking about is still going on in the news. So
Between the courts and the politicians, that's where the things get worked at and resolved. And, governments don't like the courts because they might make the government do things it doesn't want, and they would prefer to negotiate, then they can have more control over what comes out the other end.
do you
But
know?
also, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So I just want to know, because you're talking about the courts. So in the states, they I guess they get appointed in that the political, but not ours. Would it run differently there? Do they favorite their sides, like if the Democrats are in charge? You know how like they're appointed like in that, but we're in Canada, they're not. I don't know if they're quite the same, right? Like they're more
Oh.
neutral. I don't know.
In the States, their judges are elected in many places,
Oh, okay.
which is really different from us.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, I just had that question. I was just in my head.
Yeah. Well, my hope after just me racing through this story, it's not one that I think anybody would be expecting you to recount and in detail, because it's a lot of sort of peculiar pieces to the story. But it's just my hope is that you'll come away with some appreciation of how your leaders handled themselves on a whole new front, the biggest front of all politically in Canada. Again, without even at that point a lot of political experience, but they played their cards really, really well, and they have things that they can point to today that were accomplished because of their particular piece on the game board, and they were just able to strategize and work the room really, really effectively for their number of people that they were. And now I should mention, First Nations are claiming credit for the Aboriginal Rights Clause, by the way. And
I was just about to ask you that, like after when they were deciding whose table to be, like side of the table to be on, if like, let's say everything's all said and done and Peter or whoever was in like that had that relationship with Trudeau, like I wonder if they were friends after everything was said and done, or if it's just.
Well, they definitely were friends because the Peter crossed the floor to the Liberals a year later, and they finally enticed him across. But he made his move there because they'd been working on him since he landed on Parliament Hill. He told me that when he hired me right off the bat, and so he waited and waited to play his card when he thought it was going to be the most useful. Because in the 1982. In November 26th, 1982, I always remember because it was my wife's birthday. And he crossed the floor to the Liberals and joined the Trudeau government. But he didn't just give them a new member of Parliament. He got something in return. That was the deal, because he said he would finally leave the NDP and join the Liberals if the Liberal government agreed that it would start the process going that could lead to the division of the Northwest Territories and creation of Nunavut. And so get Peter to talk about that for sure. I mean, that's, yeah, so that's the biggest thing he did. Because the government up to that point didn't want to, remember earlier in this course, I was talking about, the stalemate. The Inuit leadership said in 1977, we came out with a proposal really creating a clear image of what a Nunavut territory would consist of. And the government didn't want to know about that at that time. So 5 years later, circumstances had changed somewhat. And Peter used the leverage he had as an MP, being enticed by the Liberal government to join the Liberals. He finally said, all right, I'll do it, but here's what you have to do. You have to publicly commit yourself to considering the creation of a Nunavut territory, which was going the opposite direction from where the government had been since 1977. So individuals can do very significant things in certain circumstances, you know, and Peter was in very particular circumstances, and he played his card and got the ball rolling because he had something to offer the government, which was himself.
You mentioned that they had to wait like within a year to talk about Aboriginal rights,
Yeah.
and that there were 3 conferences.
Yeah.
What was the resolution of those conferences?
Not much, as I say, they did not expand what's in the Constitution. To any significant degree, there was. I should have looked it up beforehand because it's almost forgotten, really. But it's, I think they made some acknowledgement regarding women as well. I apologize. I should have that. I'll clarify when I speak with you next. Or you can ask Peter that even. It's although he wasn't a politician after 1983, I think. Pardon me. And but no, the conferences went. You know, there were 4 conferences. The one that was promised 1 year after the Queen signed it, and then in that conference they didn't get very far, so they promised 3 more conferences, and they were big shows. But as I say, some of the premiers had very good delaying tactics, preventing decisions from being made of any kind.
And you also talked about the problem of if they did have, I think it was the Constitution of acknowledging that they have land rights, that they didn't know who would actually own the land in the end and who actually does.
Oh, the land is owned by the Crown unless it's designated otherwise. That's how it's legally functioning. It's the government in provinces, and it's provincial governments that give permits on how land can be used and by who, et cetera, et cetera. But the issue of Aboriginal rights that people have is still getting played out because those rights are out there too, but they tend to be defined in the context of specific agreements for specific areas, as opposed to all Indigenous people have X, Y, and Z rights, particular rights to their lands, and I don't think we'll ever see a sort of a national clarification of that. I think it'll get negotiated on a case-by-case basis, either in big ways or like Nunavut is an example. I mean, the biggest case, and all the Inuit land claims. That's what they've done. They've clarified your rights to particular parts of land, and the rest remains owned by the Crown, and that's what's agreed to by both parties. That help?
Yes.
The Crown is the default owner under Canadian law unless specific Aboriginal rights to certain lands is clarified in land claims agreement.
Was the first constitution written in Britain or North America?
It was written in Britain by the British House of Commons, but it was obviously designed by Canadians. And in 1864 there was a meeting, and here's a kind of a funny story how things got done in Canada. There was in 1864, I believe it was maybe it was 63, 62. Anyway, 2 of the provinces, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, were talking together about forming one province out of them, eh? And so the politicians in Quebec, Quebec City, and there was Upper and Lower Canada then, and they had and they were having some meeting in Quebec City, and they heard about this meeting that the that the politicians in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia were going to have. So they said, let's go there. And it was in the meeting was going to be in PEI, Prince Edward Island. And I guess PEI was going to be part of what they were going to talk about, a union, a maritime union. And they got there and they weren't invited, but this whole boatload of politicians show up and they ask if they can come in and join the meeting. And it turns out a lot of their time was a big piss up, and their ship was loaded with champagne and booze, and that was the meeting where they came up with the idea of confederation with Upper and Lower Canada, Ontario and Quebec, and those maritime provinces. So it's quite a fascinating story and almost funny. But the reason they got together so well is because they were getting drunk. And really, and then they go into the meetings, but they bonded socially in a big way, you might say. And so that's our country for us. Yeah. Nice to talk back and forth. I'm glad to hear you.
It's good to get some clarification and some funny stories.
Yeah. It's let's see if I can think of any other stories from the 80s. Yeah, that thing I mentioned about people up north pulling the flags down, that was really something to watch the government reaction to, boy. And because to government people down here, what? The Eskimos are mad? I mean, the Indians are always mad. Eskimos, they're always nice. They're mad? Holy shit. And we've misplayed our hand here. They were quite shocked, and it was very unsettling to them because of the sovereignty implications. You know, foreign countries seeing Inuit lowering the Canadian flag.
And did they find out because the Hamlets told the government about them lowering the flags?
I don't know how the communication went on that, because as I mentioned, CBC was now in the north, and so there was video coverage of it that was seen on television in the south, and by the government and by Southerners, and you know, just news clips. I don't know which particular communities where they did it, but they caught it on film anyway, and people had a clear understanding of why they were doing it, you know, because they were offended too, and they were asking for something simple and right, and they got stiffed just openly, and so people were just angry about it, and, not willing to play the game if the government didn't want to. But it had consequences for the government if they didn't want to. That's what they wanted to show. Sometimes symbolic actions can communicate a lot. I've been trying to find news clippings on CBC archives, and their format has changed from when I used to access stuff. So I've sent them a note, and trying to find where clips are. But I'll even look up the film, Dancing Around the Table, and it's a fascinating film. And you'll see all the players in action, and how eloquent the leaders were, for example, and but also how politicians behaved. And it was the first conference was with Pierre Trudeau, then he retired, and then the rest were Brian Mulroney, the Conservative Prime Minister, for 3 years. And he always, Mulroney, in those conferences in 84, 85, and 87, he was a smart guy. He'd come on, in his opening statements, he'd make it sound like he was in favor of everything, and because he knew there were not going to be enough premiers going to say yes to it. So why did he need to look bad himself? Let the premiers look bad in the public eye. So, you know. But if I find it, I'll send a link around to Dan and Paul. I'd happily watch it with you too. but Peter will be a good guy to have in right next. So make the most of him. And he lives near Ottawa. He's retired now.
Is he coming on Tuesday or Wednesday?
Wednesday, that's what the schedule is.
Okay.
Yeah, he's got good stories. He's a very thoughtful guy, very smart guy. Yeah, have you guys seen the Experimental Eskimos film already?
I think we watched a part of it.
And they were watching it in contempt last week, I think.
Yeah, we did. The thing is, like, I wanted to know more of the effects it had on the individuals who did go through the experiment.
Mhm.
It was nice to see like the story, like that they did go and like the whole purpose of the experiment and what they kind of got from it and growing to be into the leadership positions they've been in.
Well, you look at the one picture I was showing of the ICNI leadership, there's Peter, there's Eric. Eric was president of ITC for a couple of years in 76, 77. And Peter was the first MP. I mean, this is 10 years after they were high school students, and so they certainly rose to the top pretty fast. And there was a gathering in Ottawa about, maybe 10 years ago now. Some local group that does these events every year to focus our attention on Indigenous people and issues. And they showed the film, the Experimental Eskimos film, but they somehow managed to arrange for Peter and Eric and Zebedee to come together, and we have that on film somewhere, and that's a rare piece of footage. And they were on the panel and they talked about their experiences, and the consequences of having gone through that, good and bad. It's living history, you guys. It's still living history. So it'll never happen again, that kind of stuff. So make the most of it.
Last semester, Alaka would talk about Section 35 of the Charter Rights on Freedom, and her approach was kind of like it's a controversial topic. And why would you think she would say that?
I don't know. First of all, Section 35 is not part of the charter. It's a separate part of the Constitution, and the charter goes from about Section 1 to 15. But anyway, that's just the technical one. So it's not under the charter itself. Controversial? It's yeah, because it didn't give a complete definition of what Aboriginal rights consisted of. That was why the First Nations were so sort of against it initially. And they wanted it all spelled out first because they couldn't trust the government to do it someday, and which has been true. And so that it remains controversial because it doesn't say enough, doesn't give enough detail, and that locks in certain kinds of rights and everywhere in Canada. So I'm sure it's yeah, people can still have dissatisfaction with it because just for that reason, it's just a foot in the door, but it hasn't expanded into much more. But it does.
Okay, because
yeah. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Because it's very vague, right? When you read it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't say what the rights are. They're just there.
Mm-hmm.
But, and one of the issues was this is an interesting but technical legal approach, different approaches to defining what Aboriginal rights are. One approach is it consists of certain kind of rights, and all we're going to do is open like a box. We're going to open up the box, and it's full of our rights. If you're Indigenous, this is it's full of our rights. Let's just say what they are. They're already existing. The other approach is this is an empty box, and there's no rights in there unless we decide to put them in, meaning the governments. And so that's controversial in that way too, in terms of understanding of the whole notion of where rights come from. Do they come from? do Indigenous people have rights because they always had those rights before Kablunak came? Or do Indigenous people have Aboriginal rights only on the basis of what Kablunak governments give them, put in the box, right? And so, and that the word that debate hangs around is the word inherent. Do people have, are the governments recognizing rights that people already had, that were inherent, that went with their relationship to the land? Or are the rights being rights that are created by governments and given to people? Interesting questions. That's why that's lots of controversy on that stuff, you know? And so, and governments won't agree to treating those rights as inherent. They only want rights recognized that they approve of, you know, put in the box. So, yeah, that's lots of controversy around that issue. It's not a very active issue, but it's you know, essentially that's yeah. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. What do you think?
All right, thank you. No, that gives me a different perspective on that now too.
Yeah, I mean, there's more than one answer to that question. That's where the controversies are. Right? People, different players will answer it differently, and according to their interest. You know?
True.
Government don't like people having rights that are unpredictable, and could mean a lot more than they would wish. So they like to be in control of what rights are in the box. But you know, is that fair? Well, that's different. You know, different sides come down on that one depending on their interests. Santa Claus was there. Look at that. We used to have Santa Claus come in every year. You guys see that?
I see it.
Yeah. Anyway, anything else you're wondering about? Anything? What do you think about all that stuff? What kind of reaction do you get from learning about that particular story?
I feel like I take for granted that we have rights in a way because they put so much effort in ensuring that we have our rights that we have today, and just knowing that there's a chance that if Inuit and First Nations people and like everyone across Canada didn't like protest, that there's a chance that I wouldn't even have rights today.
Yeah, yeah. And I do find it heartening that so many Canadians cared about this, cared about you guys that have no connection to you whatsoever, but just it offended their sense of who we are as a country, that people could be treated that way. And population just across the country was just up in arms over this. And I found that very heartening. And on the, yeah, we expect more of our politicians than that kind of unfairness. And so many people were willing to step up and make it known that they did not approve.
So all this to say, what we're learning is all for power and money at that time, that when Trudeau was in the seat, right?
Oh, it's definitely about power, boy. When you're dealing at that level, that's what they do. They're debating who's got the power over what, and of course, with power comes access to the wealth of the land, one way or another. Yeah. But it's big politics at that level, the biggest. So They learn fast, those guys, those folks. Mary Simon was a part of that circle too, very, very much a part of that circle, especially in the 80s. She was at the table in the constitutional conferences on behalf of Inuit.
When was the Charter of Rights passed?
1982, it was part of the Constitution. It's called the Canada Act. The whole thing is the Constitution is called the Canada Act, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is the first section of it. It goes on and does all the other things that constitutions do about designing our systems of government, and when elections are called, and this Constitution did some new things that the old one didn't do, and it entrenched something called equalization payments. So the government collects tax, the federal government collects taxes for every Canadian, and they share some of that money with provinces. But some provinces are small and poor, others are rich. Maritime provinces tend to be poor, they don't have a big tax base. Alberta is really rich because of all its oil and gas. BC is wealthy, and because of its resources. And so because the federal government has a commitment to making basic levels of services available to all Canadians, health is being one, and they built into the Constitution the federal government's obligation to equalize the sort of the wealth of the different provinces. And so basically Alberta pays more taxes into the pot, and that some of that pot goes to maritime provinces and provinces have agreed to that, which is good. Because not every province has the same access to resources and revenue from that.
All right. Any more comments? There's dead silence there. Ask your questions now. Use Murray while he's here.
That's good. Good. I'm glad you're asking questions. It's nice to talk, elaborate on things. Don't make it clear.
Was the only reason Trudeau wanted to rewrite the Constitution was because he was tired of trying to make decisions with all of the provinces?
Yes, that's half the reason, and the other half was the importance of dealing with Quebec, the issue of Quebec in Canada.
Oh yeah.
Because they were signaling in a very big way. There's a lot of Quebecers were willing to commit themselves to separating from the country, and so they had to figure out a constitution. I mean, they weren't satisfied with their position under the old BNA Act. It didn't give them enough power to protect the French culture, et cetera, et cetera. So they wanted any new constitution was intended to stretch wider and allow more room for Quebec to be satisfied and stay in Canada, basically. What that took, we never knew, but because when their government was committed to separating, what are the chances they were going to agree to any formula that was going to keep them in Canada? So they had to do something though, just to show that Canada was being responsive to their popular opinions and aspirations. So there was a motivation on that one. I've got an idea. I don't know. Let me run it past you, just see what you think. Because I don't know everybody well enough, and I certainly haven't been able to match people's names and faces. If everybody was willing to turn on their video, I'd take a screenshot and your names would be on it, and I'd get to know you all. Anybody interested? I know some of you already, but oh, great. Yay. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And now we
Paul-
can see who.
Paul,
Now
I
we can,
don't know if I need you, Paul.
now we can see who's actually here. All right.
Oh, this is so good. Thank you so much. And I'll wait for a few more, see if they're actually gonna. Come on, lads, we need guys in here. Well, I'm really happy I thought of this because I want to be able to speak to you by name when we see each other. Hey, I knew you were there. Donna, Pauline, any chance?
I know Pauline was having issues with her internet, so
Okay. All right, I'll see if I can take a screenshot. Oh, thank you. Smile. Thank you, folks. That's really great. Love it. You look great. Oh, there's Donna. Oh, yeah. Oh, well. Hi, Donna. All right. Anyway, anybody else want to do any more? So Paul, you're accountable to Paul for all the questions and stuff like that, but I hope those were helpful to prep your ear for things, information going by when it was. So, boy, I'm looking out at my place right now. I'll show you what I look like from my place. I'm on the 9th floor of a condo out in the West End. It's suddenly winter again. I remember I used to tell students every year that Ottawa, welcome to Ottawa. We have about 5 winters here. And because we're right on the line between melting and freezing all pretty much throughout the winter. So it makes for a messy place. But anyway, anybody else got anything else you want to yak about? Want to see pictures of my grandkids? What do you want?
Yeah, I want to see.
Hey, let me see. You asked for them. I've got 2 in town here. 3, I got 3 actually.
Which,
And,
which one made the bracelet that you use?
which one? What?
Which one made the bracelet that you use?
This one.
You.
Totally. This is my bracelet.
What are their names?
This is Avani.
Avni.
Avani. Her dad's East Indian. Really nice, wonderful guy. And this is my guy. This is Alistair.
Alistair. Cute.
I pick him up at the daycare once in a while and walk him home. And except I take a side trip to the Dairy Queen with him, and then we have a good time. Then when he gets home, he rats on me. So anyway, grandparenting is a different kind of love, man, because there's no responsibility.
Hi, Leah.
So everything like a skating rink outside where you are?
So I haven't stepped outside yet, Murray. Today I'm getting the furnace guys here, and then the roof started leaking. I'm having lots of fun in this house I'm in now. But Dan showed his windows, you couldn't even see outside.
You can't
right?
see outside.
So cool.
Well, good luck with it all.
So I will I taped this, so I will somehow get it up tomorrow. when I get to work on my work computer, if I can transfer it from this home computer. So you guys could watch it again if you want. I'm hoping you all answered all your questions and then ask Murray the questions that you didn't know, because I answered all my questions today from his lecture.
So I won't be back for another week. You guys are going to Montreal a week on Friday, aren't you?
Are you coming in on Wednesday for the Peter,
Me?
the guest speaker when Peter comes in? Yes.
No, I won't be.
Okay, so they won't see you until the following Monday, the 17th, I
Oh.
guess.
Whoa. I'll be old by then.
Okay.
All right, well, good luck. Good. Hope you have a wonderful trip to Montreal.
Thank you.
It'd be fun to do something together like that.
Alrighty. So
Okay. Thanks for
everyone
your-
have a see you tomorrow morning for 9:30.
Ah.
They said 10:20.
Oh, they said 10:20?
Yes.
Yeah.
To be at the NAC for 10:20. But if you
Oh,
wanted
yeah.
to go to NS, you can.
Okay, I wasn't part of that meeting. Okay, it changed. The day before it was 9:15 when I told you guys I practiced. So 10:20. Okay. Well, I
What do
might
you
not
do?
see you. I don't know if I'll be at the NAC. So
How come?
What are you doing at the NAC?
they're doing their promotional videos for they were gonna do performances for a bunch of schools, but they're gonna do promotional videos. So next year that instead of going to each school to perform, the schools will come to the NAC and they'll do a whole bunch. So they're doing promotional videos about their songs, Inuit games and all that. And then there'll be a whole media campaign, I guess.
Yeah, cool.
Something Robin set up. So
Hey, I had an idea about your trip to Haida Gwaii. Let me share it.
Go.
The thing to do, instead of people doing your own presentations and stuff, what you guys might consider doing is taking a copy of the NTI's documentary, Fearless, and having your hosts arrange a public venue to screen it. So people, the Haida can come and watch your story being told by all the people in that film. And that might save you the work of standing in front of them all the time trying to say it. But then then they could talk to you afterwards. But that would be a nice community event for them to as an excuse to come together in the same place. They have a beautiful heritage center there, just gorgeous, and I'm sure they have space to view stuff from the theaters perhaps or something. Anyway, that's just an idea. Put it out there,
Well,
but
that's a good one. I'm sure some of our shy students will be all for that too.
Well, yeah, it's but they'll hear the people talking themselves about what they did, and so anyway, there's my thought for the day. Make of it what you want.
Alrighty.
All right, nice to be with you.
What's up, Rowan?
I'm wondering, I have one last question. It was Charlie Watt that had connections in the government, and that's how they were able to get a meeting with Trudeau.
Yes, and Peter, and mostly Peter.
Oh,
because he was a member of Parliament, so he was working closely with the Liberal government, liberal leaders, and because they had been trying to get him to cross the floor, from the point when he arrived there, and
That's Charlotte.
Charlotte Lee.
I miss you guys.
I miss you too.
Sorry, I'm bombarding your class, Mary, but I miss
You're
your
late
face.
for class, Charlotte.
It's okay,
$10
we-
in $10. $10
We
tomorrow.
got People's Court. You can't charge me.
put it on your tab.
I owe you.
I owe you, yeah.
What are we talking about today?
The Constitution.
Constitution.
Oh, fine. Someone asked me about the Northern Quebec Agreement yesterday, and I instantly came back into your class, Mary.
Oh, yeah. Hey, have you guys heard about People's Court? People heard about
Yes.
it? Yeah. Okay. It's,
They've heard how lucky they are to not have it,
yeah.
how broke they would be if they did.
Yeah. Well, it was an incentive for people to come to school. But
I
at
think
the
we
end-
should state it. We had
at the-
agreed.
At the end of the year, we put the money in the vault downstairs, and that we collect. And there were a couple of years where I walked down from the school down to the the bank at the corner of Sussex and Rideau and with about $6,000 in cash. And those are the fines that got collected.
I could believe it. My year Letia had like $2,000 just to her.
Really?
Yep.
And yeah, some people didn't hardly paid a cent, and some people paid weekly, had paid weekly, and never made the connection between sleeping in and costing them money. But yeah, it was a good system. And
My skin looks flawless.
what's that?
I'm admiring my skin. It looks really flawless on the camera.
All right, class is over.
Thank
Hey.
you.
Okay,
Thank
Take
you.
care.
see you guys. Nice to be with you. Thanks a lot.
See you guys tomorrow.
Toodaloo, toodaloo, Caribou.